Welcome, fellow seekers of history's shadows. Before we journey into the shadowed corridors of medieval monasteries, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're settling in for sleep in Manchester, beginning your evening wind down in Melbourne, or finding a quiet moment somewhere between, I'm grateful you've joined me here. If these explorations into history's more unsettling truths resonate with you, please subscribe so you never miss our descent into the past's darkest corners. Now, settle back and let your mind drift with me to a time when faith and fear walked hand in hand, when the promise of salvation came shadowed by the threat of damnation. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of medieval Europe, dotted with magnificent stone abbeys whose bells called the faithful to prayer. These sacred places, with their soaring arches and illuminated manuscripts, represented the very pinnacle of spiritual devotion. Yet behind their hallowed walls, in the silence between prayers, dark occurrences flowed. We've all heard the romanticized tales of medieval monasteries as bastions of learning and charity, where pious monks copied ancient texts intended to the sick. Hollywood has painted these religious orders as sanctuaries of peace populated by kindly friars and wise abbots who embodied Christian virtue. But tonight, we'll peel back that veneer of sanctity to uncover what life was truly like within these religious communities and why the shadows they cast were often longer and darker than the light they claimed to bring. The medieval church was not merely a spiritual institution, but the most powerful political and economic force in Europe. It controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and held the power of life and death over millions of souls. Within this empire of faith, the religious orders operated as elite units, bound by sacred vows, yet often corrupted by the very human desires they sought to transcend. Tonight, we'll walk the cloistered halls where ambition masqueraded as devotion, where the promise of eternal reward justified temporal cruelty, and where the pursuit of purity led to practices that would shock even the most hardened cynic. We'll meet abbots who ruled like tyrants, monks who abandoned all pretense of charity, and entire orders that became engines of oppression rather than salvation. But first, let us understand the world that gave birth to these corrupted sanctuaries. Medieval Europe was a land where death stalked every doorway, where famine and plague could wipe out entire villages in a season, and where the promise of heaven offered the only escape from an existence that was often brutally short and filled with suffering. Into this desperate world stepped the church, offering not just spiritual comfort, but tangible power over the forces that terrified the common folk. The religious orders emerged from this crucible of fear and faith. Some, like the Benedictines, traced their roots back to the earliest days of Christianity, when hermits fled to the desert to escape worldly corruption. Others, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, arose in response to the social upheavals of the High Middle Ages, promising reform and renewal. But as these orders grew in wealth and influence, many lost sight of their founding ideals, becoming instead instruments of control and exploitation. Consider the Cistercians, who began as reformers seeking to return to the pure rule of Saint Benedict. They established themselves in remote wilderness areas, clearing forests and draining swamps through back-breaking labor. Yet within generations, these same monasteries had become vast agricultural enterprises worked by an army of lay brothers who lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. The white-robed monks who had once embraced poverty now dined on delicacies, while their workers subsisted on guirel. Or examine the Knights Templar, warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while amassing vast fortunes through banking and trade. These holy warriors who claimed to fight for Christ's glory in the Holy Land became so wealthy and powerful that they posed a threat to kings and popes alike. Their eventual destruction would reveal a web of secret rituals, financial corruption, and political intrigue that reached to the very heart of medieval society. The monastic life itself, supposedly devoted to spiritual contemplation and service to God, often became a theater for the darkest human impulses. Young nobles were forced into religious life against their will, their inheritance seized by families eager to consolidate wealth. These unwilling monks and nuns brought their resentments and ambitions into the cloister, turning what should have been havens of peace into hotbeds of intrigue and violence. Within the monastery walls, a rigid hierarchy emerged that mirrored and often exceeded the cruelties of secular society. Novices were subjected to brutal hazing rituals disguised as spiritual discipline. Those who questioned authority faced punishments that ranged from public humiliation to solitary confinement in underground cells. The very vows that were supposed to liberate the soul from worldly concerns became chains that bound individuals to institutions that exploited their labor and crushed their spirits. The educational mission of the monasteries, so celebrated by modern historians, had its own dark underbelly. Knowledge was hoarded and controlled, with access limited to those who demonstrated absolute obedience to church doctrine. Books that challenged religious orthodoxy were burned, their authors persecuted as heretics. The great libraries, the monasteries, rather than being centers of free inquiry, became instruments of intellectual oppression, preserving only those ideas that reinforced the church's temporal power. Even the charitable works for which the monasteries were renowned often served more to enhance their reputation than to genuinely help the suffering. The sick who sought treatment at monastic hospitals found themselves subjected to primitive medical practices based more on superstition than knowledge. The poor, who came begging for alms, were given just enough to keep them dependent while being subjected to lectures about their moral failings. Orphans placed in monastic care often found themselves condemned to lives of unpaid servitude, their labor enriching the very institutions that claimed to protect them. The corruption extended to the very heart of monastic spirituality. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that marked religious life became empty performances divorced from any genuine spiritual meaning. Monks went through the motions of prayer while their minds dwelt on worldly concerns. The sacred texts they copied were often altered to serve political purposes, with inconvenient passages omitted or rewritten to support the church's agenda. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the religious orders perverted the very concept of divine justice. They claimed to speak for God, while using their supposed spiritual authority to justify the most appalling cruelties. Heretics were burned alive not out of hatred, the church claimed, but out of love for their souls. The Inquisition, run largely by Dominican friars, tortured confessions from its victims while maintaining that it was saving them from eternal damnation. The wealth accumulated by the monastery became a source of scandal even to medieval observers. While preaching the virtues of poverty, abbots lived in luxury that rivaled that of kings. Monastic treasuries overflowed with gold and jewels donated by the faithful. Yet the surrounding countryside often languished in poverty and neglect. The contrast between the church's teachings and its practices became so stark that it sparked reform movements and ultimately contributed to the Protestant Reformation. As we delve deeper into these dark histories, we'll uncover stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval religious life. We'll meet individuals who struggled against the corruption around them, often paying a terrible price for their integrity. We'll explore the psychological mechanisms that allowed good people to participate in evil systems. And we'll see how the pursuit of absolute power corrupted even those who began with the noblest intentions. The religious orders of medieval Europe were not simply collections of holy men and women dedicated to serving God. They were complex institutions shaped by the same human drives that motivated secular society. Greed, ambition, fear, and the desire for control. Understanding their true nature requires us to look beyond the pious facade and examine the human reality beneath. Tonight's journey will take us through monastery gates that open not onto paradise, but onto a world where spiritual authority masked temporal tyranny, where the promise of salvation came at the cost of human dignity, and where the very institutions meant to embody divine love became engines of oppression and exploitation. The darkness we'll explore is not merely historical curiosity, but a reminder of how easily noble ideals can be corrupted when power goes unchecked and authority claims divine sanction. As we prepare to enter this shadowed world, remember that the men and women we'll encounter were products of their time, shaped by beliefs and circumstances we can barely imagine. Yet their stories remain relevant because they reveal truths about human nature that transcend any particular historical period. The capacity for both great and terrible evil exists in every age, and the religious orders of medieval Europe serve as powerful examples of how thin the line between the two can be. So let us begin our exploration of these dark sanctuaries, these places where the sacred and the profane intertwined in ways that would shock the faithful who place their trust in religious authority. Part 2. The corruption of sacred vows. Behind the towering stone walls of medieval abbeys and monasteries, a darker reality fed beneath the veneer of pious devotion. While these religious houses were meant to be sanctuaries of spiritual purity, they had become breeding grounds for corruption, exploitation, and moral decay that would make even the most hardened secular lord blush. The very foundations of monastic life were built upon 3 sacred vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet in practice, these vows had become nothing more than hollow words, twisted and perverted by those who sought power rather than salvation. The irony was palpable. Men and women who claimed to have renounced the world had in fact embraced its worst impulses with a fervor that would shame the most ambitious merchant or ruthless knight. Consider the supposed vow of poverty. While peasants starved in the fields beyond monastery walls, abbots lived in opulent splendor that rivaled royal courts. They dined on roasted peacock and imported wines, while their flocks subsisted on bread and water. The monastery, Cluny and Sandini, accumulated vast treasuries of gold, silver, and precious stones, all while preaching the virtue of material detachment to the masses who funded their lavish lifestyles through crushing tithes and donations. The hypocrisy ran so deep that some abbots maintained private armies, not for protection, but for conquest. They waged wars against neighboring monasteries over land disputes, turning houses of God into fortresses of greed. The Abbey of Saint-Rié in France became infamous for its abbots' military campaigns conducted under the banner of Christ, but motivated purely by territorial expansion and wealth accumulation. The vow of chastity proved equally malleable in the hands of corrupt clergy. Behind closed doors, many monasteries operated more like brothel than houses of worship. Monks and nuns engaged in flagrant sexual misconduct, with some abbesses running what amounted to sophisticated prostitution rings. The convent of Sant'Agata in Italy became notorious throughout the region for its nocturnal visitors. Wealthy patrons who paid handsomely for the company of supposedly celibate nuns. Even more disturbing were the systematic abuses of power that occurred within these walls. Young novices, often sent to monasteries against their will by families seeking to reduce the number of mouths to feed, became victims of predatory behavior by their supposed spiritual guides. The isolation of monastic life created perfect conditions for such exploitation. With victims having no recourse and nowhere to turn for help, the third vow, obedience, became a tool of oppression. Rather than spiritual discipline, abbots wielded absolute authority over their subjects, demanding not just compliance, but complete submission of will and thought. This power was frequently abused to silence dissent, punish rivals, and maintain the corrupt status quo. Those who dared to speak out against misconduct found themselves subjected to brutal punishments, solitary confinement, or even mysterious disappearances. Perhaps most shocking was how these religious orders manipulated the very concept of salvation for financial gain. They sold indulgences with the shameless efficiency of market traders, promising reduced time in purgatory for the right price. The wealthy could literally buy their way into heaven, while the poor were left to suffer the full consequences of their sins. This commodification of divine grace represented perhaps the ultimate perversion of Christian teaching. The intellectual corruption was equally damaging to society as a whole. Monasteries, which should have been centers of learning and enlightenment, instead became fortresses of ignorance and superstition. Monks deliberately destroyed or hid ancient texts that contradicted church doctrine, burning libraries, and persecuting scholars who dared to question established dogma. The loss of classical knowledge during this period cannot be overstated. Countless works of philosophy, science, and literature vanished forever into the flames of religious fanaticism. This deliberate suppression of knowledge served a dual purpose. It kept the population ignorant and dependent while preserving the Church's monopoly on information. Literacy was actively discouraged among the common people, ensuring they remained reliant on corrupt clergy for interpretation of Scripture and divine will. The result was a society trapped in intellectual darkness, unable to progress or question the systems that oppressed them. The economic impact of this corruption extended far beyond monastery walls. Religious orders had become some of the largest landowners in medieval Europe, controlling vast estates worked by essentially enslaved peasants. These lands were often exempt from taxation, creating an unfair advantage over secular lords while depriving kingdoms of crucial revenue. The wealth accumulated by monasteries was effectively removed from circulation, hoarded in treasuries that served no productive purpose for society. Meanwhile, the genuine spiritual needs of the population went unmet. Instead of providing comfort to the suffering and guidance to the lost, corrupt clergy focused on enriching themselves and expanding their temporal power. The sick and dying were abandoned unless they could pay for prayers and last rites. Orphans and widows who should have been protected by Christian charity were often exploited as cheap labor or worse. The psychological damage inflicted by this corruption cannot be measured, but was undoubtedly profound. People who had placed their faith and trust in religious institutions found themselves betrayed and exploited by the very people who claimed to represent God on earth. This breach of trust created a deep cynicism that would eventually contribute to the collapse of medieval society's spiritual foundations. Some attempted reform, but these efforts were typically crushed by the entrenched interests that benefited from the corrupt system. Bernard of Clairvaux and other reformers tried to return monastic life to its original principles, but their movements were either co-opted or destroyed by those who profited from the status quo. The few genuinely pious individuals who remained in religious orders found themselves isolated and powerless against the overwhelming tide of corruption. The recruitment practices of these orders revealed another layer of moral bankruptcy. Rather than seeking individuals with genuine spiritual calling, monasteries often functioned as dumping grounds for society's unwanted members. Families sent their disabled children, unmarriable daughters, and troublesome sons to religious houses, paying substantial fees for the privilege. These involuntary recruits, having no desire for monastic life, often became the most corrupt members of their communities. The judicial system within monasteries operated as a parallel legal structure, exempt from secular oversight and accountability. Abbots could imprison, torture, or even execute those under their authority with complete impunity. This created pockets of lawlessness where the worst human impulses could flourish unchecked. Stories emerged of secret dungeons, mysterious deaths, and systematic torture that would make hardened criminals recoil in horror. Perhaps most damaging of all was how this corruption poisoned the very concept of religious devotion for future generations. When the supposed representatives of God on earth lived lives of such obvious hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy, it became impossible for thinking people to maintain faith in religious institutions. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation and eventual secularization of European society can be traced directly to the moral failures of medieval religious orders. The international nature of these religious orders also facilitated corruption on a massive scale. Wealth and influence could be transferred across national boundaries, creating a shadow network of power that operated beyond the control of any secular authority. This international reach allowed corrupt practices to spread like a plague, infecting religious houses across the continent with standardized methods of exploitation and abuse. As we reflect on this dark chapter in human history, we must remember that the corruption of medieval religious orders represents more than just historical curiosity. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when institutions claiming moral authority operate without accountability or transparency. The suffering inflicted by these supposedly holy men and women upon the vulnerable and defenseless stands as testimony to humanity's capacity for evil, even when cloaked in the garments of righteousness. The peasants and common folk who bore the brunt of this exploitation had no recourse, no voice, and no hope of justice. They were trapped in a system that promised salvation while delivering only suffering, that preached love while practicing cruelty, that claimed to serve God while serving only mammon, the dark underbelly of medieval monasteries. While the previous installments exposed the corruption plaguing medieval religious orders, we've only scratched the surface of the systematic abuse that festered within monastery walls. The very institutions that preach salvation became breeding grounds for exploitation that would make even the most cynical observer recoil in horror. Consider the practice of oblation, where wealthy families essentially dumped unwanted children into monasteries as early as age 7. These children, called oblates, had no choice in their fate, and were often treated as little more than indentured servants by the adult monks. Many were subjected to brutal physical and sexual abuse, their cries for help muffled by stone walls and the conspiracy of silence that protected their tormentors. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland became notorious for its treatment of these child oblates. Records reveal that young boys were routinely beaten with leather straps for minor infractions, forced to sleep in freezing cells, and denied adequate food as punishment. Some were made to carry heavy stones for hours as penance, their small bodies breaking under the weight of monastic discipline. But the abuse wasn't limited to physical violence. Sexual predation ran rampant throughout the medieval monastic system. Protected by the very hierarchy that claimed moral authority, abbots and senior monks used their positions to exploit vulnerable novices, men oblates, knowing that their victims had nowhere to turn for justice. The Church's own records, when they bothered to document such incidents at all, reveal a pattern of systematic cover-ups that would span centuries. The monastery of Cluny, despite its reputation as a center of reform, harbored some of the most egregious offenders. Albert Hugh of Cluny, canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, presided over an institution where young monks were routinely sexually abused by their superiors. When complaints were raised, victims were transferred to remote locations or simply disappeared entirely, their fate sealed by the very men who claimed to represent God's will on earth. The psychological torture inflicted within these walls was perhaps even more insidious than the physical abuse. Monks developed elaborate systems of mental manipulation designed to break the will of those under their control. They used sleep deprivation, isolation, and constant surveillance to create an atmosphere of terror that kept victims compliant and silent. At the monastery of Fleury, monks were forbidden from speaking to one another except during designated hours, creating an environment of paranoia where any gesture or glance could be interpreted as defiance. Those suspected of harboring rebellious thoughts were subjected to extended periods of solitary confinement in underground cells, emerging weeks later as broken shells of their former selves. The economic exploitation within monasteries was equally systematic and cruel. While abbots lived in luxury, enjoying fine wines and elaborate feasts, the common monks and lay brothers were forced to work like slaves, their labor generating vast wealth that never trickled down to those who created it. The monastery of Cîteaux, headquarters of the Cistercian order, accumulated enormous riches through the unpaid labor of thousands of monks and lay workers who were promised spiritual rewards in exchange for their earthly suffering. These workers were often malnourished and overworked to the point of collapse, their health sacrificed on the altar of monastic profit. Many died young from exhaustion and disease. Their bodies buried in unmarked graves, while their labor continued to enrich their religious overlords. The corruption extended to the very foundations of monastic scholarship, which we've been told preserved knowledge for future generations. In reality, monks routinely destroyed texts that challenged church doctrine, burning entire libraries to eliminate inconvenient truths. The monastery of Monte Cassino, supposedly a beacon of learning, systematically eliminated works of classical philosophy and science that contradicted Christian teaching. Monks rewrote historical accounts to glorify church leaders and vilify their enemies, creating a false narrative that painted the church as humanity's savior while hiding its role as oppressor. They forged documents to support land claims, fabricated miracles to increase donations, and altered religious texts to justify their own power and privilege. The medical practices within monasteries were often little more than sadistic experiments conducted on helpless patients. Monks, claiming to be healers, subjected the sick and dying to horrific treatments, using their suffering as opportunities to test bizarre theories about disease and the human body. The monastery. Infirmaries became chambers of torture where patients were bled to death, poisoned with toxic concoctions, and subjected to surgical procedures without any understanding of anatomy or hygiene. At the monastery of St. Bartholomew in London, monks regularly performed crude surgeries on conscious patients, believing that pain was a necessary component of healing. They amputated limbs with rusty tools, cauterized wounds with red-hot irons, and administered mercury and other poisons as medicine, all while claiming divine inspiration for their methods. The treatment of women in and around monasteries revealed another layer of systematic abuse. Nuns were routinely subjected to sexual exploitation by male clergy who visited their convents under the pretense of spiritual guidance. Many were forced into prostitution to generate income for corrupt abbesses, while others were imprisoned in convents against their will by families seeking to avoid paying dowries. The convent of San Pier Damiani in Italy became notorious for its treatment of young women who were essentially sold into religious slavery by their families. These women were forced to sign over their inheritances to the convent, then subjected to years of physical and emotional abuse designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance. Female religious institutions also served as dumping grounds for women who had been raped or otherwise disgraced in the eyes of society. These victims were forced to live as penitents, subjected to constant humiliation and punishment for crimes committed against them. They were made to wear rough hair shirts, sleep on stone floors, and subsist on bread and water while their attackers faced no consequences whatsoever. The monastery's role in perpetuating social inequality was equally devastating. While claiming to serve the poor, religious orders actually worked to maintain the very systems that created poverty in the first place. They collaborated with noble families to suppress peasant uprisings, provided religious justification for serfdom, and used their influence to prevent any meaningful social reform. The monastery of Zélate in France became a fortress of oppression, its monks working hand in hand with local lords to crush any hint of peasant rebellion. When villagers dared to demand fair treatment, the monks declared them heretics and called for military intervention to restore order. The result was a massacre that left hundreds of peasants dead and their families destitute. Perhaps most damaging of all was the way these religious orders corrupted the very concept of spirituality itself. They turned faith into a commodity to be bought and sold, transforming sacred rituals into profit-generating enterprises that enriched the church while impoverishing the faithful. The sale of indulgences, the charging of fees for basic religious services, and the manipulation of believers' fears about the afterlife created a system of spiritual extortion that would persist for centuries. The monastery of Cluny pioneered many of these exploitative practices, developing elaborate schemes to extract money from believers at every stage of life. They charged fees for baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals, ensuring that even the most basic human experiences were monetized for the church's benefit. Those who couldn't pay were denied services or forced into debt that would burden their families for generations. The psychological manipulation employed by these orders was sophisticated and ruthless. They exploited people's natural fear of death and uncertainty about the afterlife, creating elaborate mythologies about purgatory and hell that could only be overcome through generous donations to the church. They preyed on grieving families, convincing them that the souls of their departed loved ones would suffer eternal torment unless substantial payments were made to ensure their salvation. These practices created a culture of fear and superstition that stifled intellectual growth and social progress for centuries. People lived in constant terror of divine punishment, afraid to question church authority or seek knowledge outside the narrow confines of approved doctrine. The result was a society trapped in ignorance and servitude, unable to break free from the chains forged by their supposed spiritual guides. The legacy of this systematic corruption continues to echo through history, reminding us that institutions claiming moral authority are often the most dangerous when left unchecked. The medieval monasteries, far from being bastions of virtue and learning, were in many cases elaborate criminal enterprises that used religious authority to mask their exploitation of the vulnerable and defenseless. As we examine these dark chapters of history, we must remember that the true victims were not just the monks and nuns trapped within these corrupt systems, but the countless ordinary people who suffered under their oppression. Their stories, long suppressed by those who benefited from their silence, deserve to be told and remembered as a warning about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the human capacity for evil disguised as virtue. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Medieval religious orders, despite their claims of serving God and humanity, were in reality engines of exploitation and abuse that caused immeasurable suffering while enriching themselves at the expense of those they claimed to serve. The weight of shadows exposing medieval monasteries, hidden corruption. As the morning bells of Cluny Abbey echoed across the Burgundian countryside in the year 1275, Brother Thomas pulled his woolen cowl tighter against the bitter cold and descended into the depths of the monasteries. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his days. Barrels upon barrels of the finest vintages, silks from Constantinople hidden beneath rough sacking, and chests overflowing with gold coins bearing the seals of kings and merchants. This was not the poverty that Christ had commanded, nor the humility that Saint Benedict had prescribed. This was the dark reality that festered beneath the sacred vows of medieval religious orders. The monasteries and convents that dotted the European landscape were supposed to be beacons of spiritual purity, centers of learning and charity, where monks and nuns devoted their lives to prayer, study, and service to God. Yet behind their towering stone walls and beneath their soaring Gothic arches lay a web of corruption so vast and so deeply entrenched that it would take centuries to fully unravel. The very institutions that preached poverty lived in luxury. Those who vowed chastity kept concubines and mistresses. Those who promised obedience ruled like petty tyrants over vast estates worked by serfs and slaves. The corruption began at the very top. Abbots and abbesses supposedly chosen for their spiritual wisdom and devotion were more often than not appointed based on their noble birth or their ability to bring wealth and political connections to their houses. These ecclesiastical lords lived in palatial quarters, dined on exotic delicacies, and maintained retinues of servants that rivaled those of secular nobles. The Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris was notorious for its abbots, who lived more like princes than monks, hosting lavish banquets where the wine flowed freely and the entertainment was decidedly worldly. Abbot Suger of Sandon, who rebuilt his abbey church in the revolutionary Gothic style, justified his love of luxury by claiming that beautiful objects elevated the soul to God. Yet critics whispered that his true motivation was vanity and the desire to rival the splendor of kings. His successor, Albert Odo of Duyel, was even more brazen in his excesses, maintaining a private menagerie of exotic animals and commissioning illuminated manuscripts more for their artistic beauty than their spiritual content. The wealth that funded these excesses came from multiple sources, all of them morally questionable. Monasteries controlled vast estates worked by peasants who owed them labor service and a portion of their crops. These religious landlords were often harsher masters than their secular counterparts, demanding ever higher rents and services while offering little in return. The monks of Bury St. Edmunds were particularly notorious for their oppression of the local peasantry, extracting heavy taxes and fines while living in comfort behind their abbey walls. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was rampant throughout the monastic system. Wealthy families would purchase positions for their younger sons, turning abbeys into hereditary domains, where spiritual qualifications mattered far less than the size of one's purse. The Abbey of Farfa in Italy was controlled for generations by the same noble family, with each abbot passing the position to his nephew or cousin, treating the monastery's vast holdings as their personal inheritance. The sale of indulgences provided another lucrative revenue stream. These supposed remissions of punishment for sins were hawked like common merchandise, with monks and friars traveling from town to town, promising salvation to anyone willing to pay the price. Such crass commercialization of divine grace scandalized even medieval sensibilities. Yet, the practice continued because it was simply too profitable to abandon. Perhaps most shocking of all was the systematic violation of the vow of chastity. While celibacy was supposed to free religious men and women from worldly attachments, allowing them to focus entirely on their spiritual duties, the reality was far different. These relationships were so common that some bishops actually taxed priests for maintaining them, treating sexual transgression as a revenue source rather than a sin to be eliminated. The great monastery of Cluny, which at its height controlled over 1,000 religious houses across Europe, was plagued by sexual scandals. Monks were discovered living with women in quarters that were supposed to be strictly segregated. Some even fathered children, passing their illegitimate offspring off as nephews or wards. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland was forced to expel dozens of monks for sexual misconduct, while the Benedictine house at Monte Cassino, the very birthplace of Western monasticism, saw its reputation tarnished by repeated scandals involving the sexual exploitation of novices and pilgrims. Female religious communities faced even greater challenges in maintaining their vows. Convents were often used as dumping grounds for unmarriable daughters of noble families filled with women who had no genuine religious vocation. These reluctant nuns chafed under the restrictions of monastic life, leading to frequent violations of their vows. The convent of Sant'Angelo in Milan became notorious as a brothel in religious disguise, where wealthy men could purchase the favors of aristocratic nuns. When church investigators finally intervened, they discovered a complex system of bribery and coercion that had turned the sacred space into a den of vice. The educational mission of monastery is, once their greatest glory, also became corrupted by worldly concerns. While monks had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, copying ancient manuscripts and maintaining libraries when secular culture collapsed, by the High Middle Ages, many religious houses had abandoned serious scholarship in favor of more profitable pursuits. The scriptorum at many monasteries fell into disuse as monks found it more lucrative to rent out their lands or engage in trade than to spend long hours copying texts. Even worse, some monasteries actively suppressed learning that threatened their authority or wealth. When Roger Bacon, the Franciscan friar and pioneering scientist, developed new methods of inquiry that challenged traditional authority, his own order imprisoned him for years. The monastery of San Lorenzo in Florence was accused of deliberately destroying ancient Greek texts that contradicted Christian doctrine, while the Abbey of Reichal was said to have sold priceless manuscripts to merchants who used the parchment for wrapping goods. The corruption extended to the very practice of worship itself. The elaborate liturgical ceremonies that filled monastic days became empty theatrical performances recited by rote with no spiritual feeling. Monks would race through their prayers to finish quickly, mumbling Latin words they barely understood. Some hired substitutes to perform their religious duties while they attended to more worldly concerns. The divine office, which was supposed to sanctify every hour of the day, became a burden to be endured rather than a joy to be embraced. Even charity, the cornerstone of Christian virtue, was perverted by monastic greed. While monasteries maintained hospitals and fed the poor, these works of mercy were often used as covers for less noble activities. The Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome was discovered to be selling the bodies of deceased patients to anatomists, while the almshouse attached to Westminster Abbey was found to be diverting food meant for the poor to the monks' own tables. The very architecture of medieval monasteries reveals the depth of their corruption. While the rules of monastic orders called for simplicity and poverty, the great abbey churches that still dominate the European landscape were monuments to pride and ostentation. After Thomas Becket was killed, Canterbury Cathedral had to be rebuilt, costing a fortune that could have provided a year's worth of food for thousands of impoverished families. Critics viewed these expenditures as monuments to human vanity, while the monks justified them as gifts to God. Medieval civilization was significantly impacted by these corrupt ecclesiastical houses' economic might. Monasteries, who were frequently more focused on preserving their material interests than pursuing spiritual aspirations, rose to prominence in the feudal system by owning enormous tracts of land and riches. They fought wars against one another, maintained private armies, and fought over territory with nearby lords. Despite being purportedly devoted to the same Christian deity, the Abbey of Cluny and the Abbey of Cîteaux engaged in acrimonious conflicts over ownership of daughter houses and their profits. Military organizations such as the Knights Hospitaller and Templar were the pinnacle of this militarization of monasticism. These organizations were first established to safeguard pilgrims and treat the ill during the Crusades, but they soon rose to prominence as global financial institutions and independent military forces. Because of the Templars' enormous fortune and clandestine activities, they were distrusted and envious, and King Philip IV of France, who feared their influence and desired their wealth, finally destroyed them. Medieval religious order corruption was a systematic issue that stemmed from the basic framework of medieval civilization rather than being only the result of personal moral flaws. The very worldliness that monks were meant to avoid eventually corrupted them as they rose to prominence as political and landowners. Instead of being practiced, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were observed as meaningless formalities in the breach. However, we must keep in mind that not all religious institutions descended to such extremes of corruption, even as these troubling facts about medieval monasticism are revealed. Reformers have always attempted to restore their societies to their founding principles. In spite of the corruption all around them, some monks and nuns led lives of true holiness. While leaders like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux preached against the excesses of their time, the 12th century Cistercian reform movement sought to restore monastic simplicity. However, these reform initiatives were up against a strong current. Monasticism was susceptible to the lures of riches and power because of its own institutional achievements. One could only wonder how many of those who answered the call were genuinely seeking God, and how many were just following the procedures of a system that had lost its way when night descended over the medieval countryside. And the devout were summoned to prayer by the bells of corrupt abbeys. From Cluny's wine vendors to the Templars' counting offices, from the brothels masquerading as convents to the scriptorums where antiquated knowledge was offered for sale for silver, the shadows that hung above medieval monasteries were long and black. These were organizations that had lost their mission, societies that had become disoriented, and individuals who had exchanged everlasting benefits for fleeting joys. The everlasting human battle between the sacred and the profane, between the call to transcendence and the draw of earthly corruption, is reflected in their rise and fall. These shadows continue to hang on us now, serving as a reminder that even the holiest establishments can be corrupted by wealth and power. We might think about Brother Thomas as we close our eyes and go to sleep, still wandering those shadowy cellars, witnessing the disconnect between religious ideals and human reality, and bearing the weight of knowledge that would alter his perception of the holy orders he had once held in such high regard. Let us look at the very organization that promised salvation but frequently provided something far more evil as night falls on the country and the last of the embers die in peasant hearths. The purpose of the monasteries and convents that dot the medieval landscape was to serve as sanctuaries where the devout may interact with God via prayer, introspection, and selfless service. Another story, however, was told inside those sacred walls, behind the illuminated texts and recited psalms, a tale of widespread corruption and unbridled cravings that caused the very pillars of Christian virtue to collapse under the weight of human weakness. Because the religious orders that professed to have given up worldly pleasures had created their own chains, chains of gold and silver, of land and political influence, of secrets that would make even the most seasoned sinner shudder in horror, while the peasants we just saw worked in mud and misery, shackled to their lords by chains of servitude. These weren't the minor transgressions of frail flesh that could be pardoned with a few Hail Marys and a repentant act. These were deliberate betrayals of all that the monastic life purported to stand for. A different trinity prevailed in the abbeys and priories that were dispersed throughout Christendom, where monks and nuns were said to have made sacred vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The mild teachings of Christ had been replaced by avarice, lust, and the brutal quest for temporal power. Kings would have been jealous of the splendor enjoyed by the very men and women who taught the peasants to be humble. Even the most worldly nobility were scandalized by the sensual pleasures of those who advocated celibacy. While the impoverished starved at their gates, those who talked of charity hoarded wealth. The way they used their spiritual authority as a weapon, however, was possibly the most horrifying of all. The authority to proclaim someone blessed or damned, to offer prayers to the Almighty on behalf of needy souls, and to offer or refuse salvation. This most important duty, this holy trust, was reduced to a mere instrument of control, extortion, and manipulation. The church that professed to be Christ's bride had evolved into something much worse, a predator that preyed on the hopelessness and faith of the defenseless. Instead, we discover the meticulous documenting of money transactions, the recording of bribes, and the deletion of unpleasant truths within the scriptorum, where patient scribes were supposed to copy sacred writings for the benefit of future generations. Library that ought to have held the knowledge of the ages were instead filled with the banal chronicles of decay on earth rather than the ethereal mysteries of divine contact. Books of accounts that describe the sale of salvation, ledgers that track the absolution cost. Correspondents set up the trade of material riches for spiritual favors. What the monastery become was not what their founders had envisioned. They were no longer religious societies that sought to become closer to God by avoiding material worries. Rather, they had transformed into corporate entities, huge commercial ventures that just so happened to disguise their profit margins in religious terms. With its focus on community living and simplicity, St. Benedict's rule has been corrupted into a charter for excess and exploitation. Think of Cluny's Big Abbey in France. Once the crown jewel of the Benedictine order, it possessed resources comparable to those of kings and oversaw hundreds of subsidiary monasteries throughout Europe by the height of the Middle Ages. While his monks got fat on the labor of peasants who thought their tithes were buying them a place in paradise, the abbot of Cluny lived in accommodations that would shame a palace and dined on delicacies brought from all across the known world. Families made frantic donations to the abbey's churches in the hopes of buying the salvation of departed loved ones, and the churches gleamed with gold and valuable stones. However, material luxury was just the start. In the cloisters, where contemplation and quiet ought to have been paramount, a different form of communion was occurring. The sacred commitment to maintain physical and spiritual purity, known as the vow of celibacy, had devolved into a mere formality that could be creatively evaded. Children born to monks' mistresses in neighboring villages would never be aware of their real fathers. Even the most debauched courtiers would have been scandalized by the liaisons the nuns engaged in, their practices of hiding pregnancy that resulted in secret agreements with midwives. While sexual misconduct was shocking enough, the corruption went well beyond that. Abbots and abuses plotted with kings and nobles, exchanging spiritual influence for earthly power, and these religious communities had developed into hubs of political intrigue. They set up strategic marriages, rigged papal elections, and even incited wars when it suited them. Instead of renunciating the world, the men and women had transformed into puppet masters, manipulating strings from behind the veil of religious authority. The way they preyed on the weakest people in society was the most unsettling of all. Young children who were given to monasteries by impoverished parents who were unable to provide for them ended up ensnared in establishments that showed no concern for their spiritual well-being. These so-called oblates were abused in ways that went against every Christian compassion precept. As a necessary discipline for the salvation of young souls, physical violence was commonplace. However, there were even more sinister offenses. Such heinous deeds were meticulously concealed behind walls of complicity and quiet. In order to provide for the comfort of their superiors, novices and younger members of the monastic communities worked as unpaid laborers rather than as spiritual apprentices, creating their own internal economies of exploitation. Instead of serving as models of humble service, the abbots and priors ruled like feudal lords, expecting complete loyalty from their subjects despite having no earthly authority of their own. Since they professed to speak for God, who would dare to disagree with the Almighty's voice? This corruption was not limited to a small number of dishonest people or a few unscrupulous organizations. It permeated every aspect of medieval religious life and was systemic. From local priests to Rome's cardinals, the church hierarchy participated in the upkeep of this system of spiritual extortion. They actively participated in the purchase and sale of ecclesiastical positions, accepted payments to disregard concerns, and turned a blind eye to blatant abuses. The buying of religious offices, or simony, had become so widespread that it was hardly noticed. Perhaps the most egregious instance of this monetization of salvation was the sale of indulgences. These documents, which purportedly reduced time in purgatory or granted forgiveness of sins, were sold like any other goods. Traveling salespeople carrying cartloads of spiritual pardons for sale would arrive in cities and villages with the authority of Rome. They said that any sin might be pardoned for the correct payment. Any departed family member might be released from the agonies of the afterlife. Because they thought they were getting God's favor, which was more valuable than gold, the desperate and the credulous dumped their purses. However, the religious orders exploited people's faith and fear even more. They produced relics, asserting that common bones belonged to saints, that pieces of wood were taken from the real cross, and that bits of cloth had come into contact with the Virgin Mary's clothing. Then, these fake artifacts were used to draw pilgrims who would spend their entire life savings and travel hundreds of miles to revere what they considered to be sacred items. The gifts of the faithful made the monks that kept these phony relics rich, and they constructed ever more ornate shrines to showcase their phony treasures. Once a sincere effort to convey and preserve knowledge, the monastery's educational goal had also been tainted. Their monopoly on literacy and learning allowed them to keep their control over an uneducated public by hoarding information rather than teaching freely and openly. To make sure that only the writings that upheld their authority survived, they closely monitored which texts were copied and kept. Under centuries of institutional orthodoxy, dissenting voices were muffled, their works erased, and their thoughts buried. Even the most basic Christian obligation, to practice charity, had been corrupted into a means of manipulation and control. In fact, the monasteries would provide food and medical care to the underprivileged, but only under strict conditions. Monastic charity recipients were supposed to spread the news about the religious community's generosity, accept whatever treatment they got without protest, and demonstrate appropriate deference. Those who voiced doubts or criticism were denied aid, and they were left to starve or perish as role models for others. These religious organizations' corruption was evident in their very design. The massive monasteries. Cathedrals emerged like monuments to earthly ambition in place of the modest, basic buildings that would have been appropriate for communities committed to self-denial and poverty. Their towers rose towards heaven in a haughty display of might rather than in a spirit of pleading. Their walls surrounded hubs of worldly influence rather than places of worship. Instead of spiritual wealth, their treasuries were brimming with money and silver that had been stolen from the devout. Instead, we see tribunals where dissent was suppressed and conformity was enforced by fear and intimidation within the chapter houses, where monastic communities were meant to congregate for spiritual conversation and mutual correction. Those brothers and sisters who ventured to question the increasing corruption in their communities were charged of heresy and put through fake trials. They were persecuted by the very individuals who ought to have been their spiritual family, who used the power of religion to suppress anyone who dared to challenge their cozy arrangements. Originally designed to provide lodging for pilgrims and tourists, the guest houses become hubs for political intrigue and espionage. They kept a close eye on the visitors, recorded their chats, and evaluated their loyalty. The biggest bidder, be it a monarch or a rebel, a pope or an anti-pope, purchased the information obtained from these purportedly neutral sanctuaries. Communities that owed their initial allegiance to their own temporal interests rather than to God betrayed the ancient tradition of sanctuary, which held that religious structures would provide protection to those in need. Most regrettably, in many communities, the spiritual life that was meant to be at the center of monastic life had completely died out. Men and women whose thoughts were preoccupied with material matters reduced the hours of prayer to ceremonial recitations, murmured mindlessly. They used the time they should have spent in meditation and contemplation to plan their next political move or commercial endeavor, instead of bringing them closer to the divine. Pursuits that any secular businessman or nobleman would have coveted have replaced the very goal for which these communities had been established, the pursuit of holiness and connection with God. Even the most revered facets of religious life were corrupted. The core mystery of the Christian faith, the Mass, became a commodity that could be purchased and sold. To be spoken for their souls or the souls of their relatives, wealthy donors would pay for hundreds or thousands of Masses. And the monastery would follow through by holding perfunctory rituals that fulfilled the contract's formal requirements while utterly disregarding its spiritual purpose. Priests turned the most serious rites of their faith into assembly line productions intended to maximize profit by rushing through several Masses in a single day, babbling the sacred words without meaning or reverence. Instead of providing sinners with spiritual instruction and forgiveness, the confessional, a hallowed place, became a source of information and a tool for extortion. Priests and monks who listened to the confessions of influential people would keep in mind what they had heard and use it to further their own or their organization's goals. When it suited their interests, the clergy frequently broke the seal of confession, one of their most sacred duties. The very persons who had offered them forgiveness turned their secrets against penitents who had exposed their souls in the hope of heavenly pardon. Those who could have profited most from the contents of the monastic libraries, those stores of wisdom and information that ought to have been riches for all of humanity, were purposefully excluded. While individuals perished from diseases that could be cured, rare medical texts that could have saved lives were kept hidden. While kingdoms collapsed due to avoidable errors, historical chronicles that may have taught monarchs valuable lessons were obscured. Ignorance and superstition thrived, while scientific treatises that could have improved human understanding were prohibited. Instead of protecting knowledge, the monasteries had turned into its jailers, storing it like any other precious resource. Death, the ultimate equalizer that ought to have served as a reminder to these religious communities of their own mortality and the futility of earthly endeavors, turned into yet another pretext for abuse. In return for substantial bequests to the monastery, the wealthy were given extravagant funeral rites and eternal prayers for their souls. The impoverished, whose spirits were presumably less deserving of divine regard, were interred in unmarked graves with little ceremony. It was discovered that the promise of Christian equality before God was a fiction, and that salvation itself was only accessible to those who could pay the right amount. When young people came to these communities in search of spiritual fulfillment, they discovered a system that was set up to depress them and take advantage of their hard work. For small transgressions, novices received severe physical penalties, and their wills were methodically crushed until they were obedient instruments of their masters. Those who demonstrated intelligence or talent were either expelled completely or coerced into taking part in the system's crimes. Rather of generating the next generation of spiritual leaders, the groups were producing furious apostates or cynical collaborators, because their purported spiritual fathers frequently saw them as sexual prey rather than as equals in the quest for holiness. The female religious communities had to endure even more atrocities. Instead of protecting their charges, abbesses subjected them to the lusts of dishonest clergy. Men who had made celibacy vows became pregnant with nuns who had devoted their lives to God. Their offspring were either abducted to unknowable places or slain at birth. Convents, which ought to have been places of chastity, started to resemble upscale brothels. Their residents are imprisoned by their commitments and the absence of other options. The very compassion that Christian communities were meant to be known for turned into a weapon of control and oppression. It is true that monasteries would provide care for the sick and impoverished, but always in ways that upheld their own power and the social order that was in place. They instructed the impoverished to accept their position in life as God's will, be thankful for what little they have, and look forward to benefits in the hereafter rather than pursuing justice in this one. Christ's radical teaching, which focused on upholding the weak and opposing the powerful, was meticulously rewritten and sterilized until it bolstered rather than endangered the established quo. We must keep in mind that these were not isolated instances or the deeds of a few terrible actors as we reflect on these somber realities of medieval ecclesiastical life. This corruption was systematic, institutional, and intentional. All that religious life was meant to stand for was fundamentally betrayed by it. Instead of being models of virtue and sanctity, these men and women had turned into some of the most dishonest and predatory people in medieval society. The impact this corruption had on the sincere religion of common people, however, was arguably its most sad feature. The very institutions that the peasants and townspeople trusted most, the church, abandoned them when they looked to it for moral leadership and spiritual guidance. They took advantage of their genuine devotion. Their confidence was returned with deceit and abuse, and their fervent hope for salvation was turned into a commodity. In addition to being a failure of personal ethics, the corruption of the holy orders signified the systematic dismantling of the spiritual underpinnings of medieval civilization. This corruption's legacy would reverberate throughout the centuries, eroding trust in religious organizations and fueling the massive upheavals that would ultimately transform European society. Watered by the cries of the exploited faithful and fertilized by the accumulated grievances of centuries who had been deceived by those who claimed to speak for God, the Protestant Reformation's seeds were sown in the fields of monastic corruption. We then find ourselves wondering what kind of prayers are actually being delivered in those chapels lighted by candles as the bells of Compline ring out across the darkening landscape, beckoning the religious groups to their last prayers of the day. Are they sincere displays of devotion and faith, or are they just another meaningless ritual carried out by people whose souls have been perverted by power and whose hearts have been hardened by greed? The perverse realm of medieval religious orders is far more complex than most people would like to think. Even though we have revealed the corruption that existed within the walls of monasteries, the darknesses, tendrils have spread throughout society, suffocating many who sought true spiritual solace. You see, the most terrible kinds of exploitation had found a home inside the fundamental underpinnings of monastic life. In essence, desperate or aspirational families sold younger blates, children as young as 7 years old, into these facilities. Depraved abbots and senior monks turned these helpless souls into playthings, seeing their positions as license for horrible violence rather than as sacred trusts. The corruption was ruthless, methodical, and systemic. In order to ensure that their crimes were concealed from the public, monasteries established complex networks for the trafficking of these children between institutions. The unimaginable is hinted at in documents from the era in which they survive. Records describe quiet payments given to families who ventured to ask too many questions, of novices who inexplicably vanished during the night, and of extraordinary penalties given behind closed doors. However, the physical mistreatment was just the start. Psychological torture was refined into an art form by these religious orders. They would purposefully cut off youngsters from any surviving familial ties, then use malnutrition, lack of sleep, and ongoing fear to gradually destroy their sense of self. The intention was to produce fully cooperative victims who would never dare to talk about what they had gone through. Presumably a center for education and spiritual reflection, the monastery scriptorum turned into a forging workshop for documents that would conceal these crimes. Children who had been murdered were given fake death certificates. The extortion of mourning families was concealed by fraudulent records of voluntary donations. To quiet the accusers and protect the guilty, even confessional records were changed. The fact that the church leadership was aware of these crimes and actively took part in their concealment only serves to heighten the horror. Bishops would frequently move well-known predators to new monasteries, providing them with new areas to hunt. Papal leaots included sealed directives that effectively gave some high-ranking clergy protection in return for financial and political support for Rome. The scale of this corruption's economic apparatus was astounding. Using their religious authority to sell products, launder money, and destroy competitors, monasteries functioned as medieval crime syndicates. They dominated enormous commerce networks that spanned Europe, in addition to huge land tracts. Merchants would have their warehouses burned to the ground, their ships sunk, or their products inexplicably spoilt if they didn't pay security money. To communicate about their illicit activities, the orders created their own codes and secret languages. Claiming to be religious conversations, these coded messages orchestrated everything from the removal of witnesses to the transportation of stolen goods. Archaeological evidence from monastery excavations has shown mass graves with the corpses of individuals who opposed them, underground passageways for relocating captives, and hidden chambers housing torture equipment. The way these religious institutions turned faith itself into a weapon was possibly the most unsettling of all. They persuaded their victims that speaking up would condemn them to an eternity of agony, that resistance was wicked, and that suffering was the result of divine will. Because of how successful this psychological deception was, many victims actively defended their abusers, thinking that their suffering was somehow essential to their salvation. Every facet of medieval life was ensnared by the tentacles of corruption. Hospitals were run by monasteries, which transformed them from havens of healing into terrifying places where the weak and ill were taken advantage of for their last bits of money before being abandoned to suffer to their deaths. They operated schools where youngsters were taught that to complete obedience to religious authorities was the highest virtue, and where education turned into brainwashing. There was no way out of their depravity, not even death. These orders claimed the authority to decide who should be buried in a Christian cemetery and regulated burial grounds. In order to prevent their loved ones from being cast into unmarked pits with criminals and heretics, families had to pay astronomical amounts. The living were coerced, and the deceased were dishonored by the threat of spiritual damnation. The degradation of the intellect was just as destructive. As purported defenders of study and wisdom, these monasteries routinely destroyed books that questioned their rule or revealed their wrongdoings. Thousands of ancient manuscripts that included historical documents, philosophical ideas, and scientific discoveries were destroyed by fire. Propaganda that bolstered their authority and legitimized their brutality took the place of true scholarship. What was more terrible was the medical knowledge they repressed. Because they endangered the Church's monopoly on healing, texts that described anatomical knowledge, medicinal preparations, and surgical techniques that may have saved many lives were purposefully destroyed. These orders sentenced Europe to centuries of medical ignorance and needless misery rather than conserving the wisdom of antiquity. Monasteries for women experienced particular tragedies. Nuns were effectively life in prison. They were at the mercy of male religious leaders who treated them more like property than like human beings. Through systematic maltreatment, forced labor, and intentional malnourishment, young women who displayed any intelligence or independence were broken. Numerous convents turned into breeding sites where rape victims' children were either killed at birth or reared as slaves inside the monastery. The very sacraments themselves were corrupted as well. These groups claimed that bits of bone or wood had extraordinary healing properties and sold desperate travelers bogus relics. They demanded exorbitant payments for prayers that were never offered, masses that were never said, and intercessions that only existed on falsified papers. With monks effectively selling tickets to heaven to anybody who would pay their fee, the sale of indulgences grew into a huge industry. These institutions caused psychological harm that persisted for generations. Survivors who managed to flee frequently lived traumatized lives, unable to build meaningful relationships or trust others. When faced with memories too terrible to handle, many resorted to violence, drunkenness, or insanity. For innumerable souls who had experienced the ultimate betrayal of sacred trust, the very idea of religious faith was poisoned. The most tragic aspect of these crimes is that they were perpetrated in God's name, while disguising acts of pure evil with words of compassion, mercy, and salvation. Those who committed these crimes persuaded themselves and others that their victims were somehow deserving of their fate, that suffering was a spiritual cleansing process, and that their own acts were mandated by God. The cover-up went well beyond the boundaries of the monastery. Local aristocrats who relied on the church for legitimacy took an active role in erasing evidence and stifling victims. Royal courts ignored even the most blatant atrocities out of fear of excommunication and papal retaliation. The entire medieval power structure joined forces to defend these illegal businesses, masquerading as places of worship. Stunning prosperity based on human suffering is depicted in the economic records that have survived. Monasteries amassed enormous wealth by extortion, theft, and the methodical exploitation of the weakest elements of society rather than via hard work or divine favor. They lived in luxury while preaching the virtues of self-denial and poverty, erected gorgeous structures while children chilled in rags, and hoarded riches while their neighbors starved. The worst tragedy is that for decades to come, this perversion tainted the concept of spiritual seeking itself. Those who sincerely wanted to connect with God were ensnared in structures that took advantage of their faith, their weakness, and their fervent desire for purpose in a cruel world. Institutions that professed to represent real spirituality but were the exact opposite of it almost put out the light of it. This sinister legacy had an impact on the evolution of social structures, ecclesiastical organizations, and interpersonal interactions for many generations, casting shadows that went well beyond the medieval age. These betrayals of trust left behind wounds that have reverberated throughout history, including cycles of violence, cynicism, and spiritual emptiness. Recognizing how power can corrupt even the most revered institutions when it is not restrained by true responsibility is what it means to understand this darkness, not to criticize faith per se. Those who claim to speak for God are frequently the ones who have forgotten what true holiness truly entails, as the medieval religious orders chillingly remind us. Their deliberate destruction of the prospect of genuine spiritual community frequently violated their vows to serve the divine. The North Berwick convent gained notoriety for being a place where young ladies vanished into the night. Later, their carcasses were discovered floating in space, their flesh etched with odd marks. Families that requested explanations were informed that their daughters had been summoned to serve God in ways that were incomprehensible to mortal minds. The Church's role in the slave trade, despite openly denouncing the practice, was perhaps the most startling of all. Scottish monasteries bought and sold people in secret, like cattle, and marked their ownership with sacred emblems. Large-scale human trafficking networks were maintained by the Cistercian Abbey of Dundrennan, which imported exotic slaves to work in their Scottish establishments and shipped Scottish peasants to work in their foreign holdings. Only the criminals themselves failed to see the irony. Even the sacraments that serve as the cornerstone of the Christian religion were corrupted. In order to guarantee that infants would be sent to limbo unless their families paid extra for appropriate ceremonies, priests would purposefully mess up baptisms. Rather than any valid religious justification, marriages were annulled and reformed, depending on the amount of bribes. In order to gain entry to the hereafter, deceased souls were compelled to give up their material belongings, perverting even the last rites. The local clergy they were supposed to oversee were no better than the papal delegates who traveled to Scotland. Cardinal Beaton's lavish lifestyle was so extravagant that his household expenses were higher than those of the Scottish monarchy. Claiming to be married only to the Church, he kept a horde of concubines, each more attractive than the one before. His extravagant dinner parties, which included entertainment that would have made Roman emperors blush with embarrassment, were legendary. Because monks studied the dark arts of control and manipulation rather than theology, the monasteries had devolved into hubs of learning in the most perverse sense. They developed methods of psychological torture that were passed off as spiritual counseling, shattering the minds of anyone who ventured to challenge their power. Once a center of learning and enlightenment, the Iona Scriptorum had been turned into a factory for fake records and histories, rewriting history to support current wrongdoing. Even the sacred artifacts that attracted pilgrims from all over Europe were intricate hoaxes. The bones purportedly belonging to saints were frequently the remains of heretics and criminals who were blessed by dishonest priests and then sold to the highest bidders. A brave monk exposed the sacred root of Scotland, which was said to hold a piece of the cross of Christ, as being nothing more than ordinary oak wood drenched in pig blood. The monk was discovered dead in his cell upon the revelation of this information, seemingly having committed suicide in a moment of regret. The system of tithe had developed into an advanced extortion scheme that would have made contemporary criminals jealous. Families were compelled to give over their boys and girls in addition to their harvests and cattle. While their families were informed that the young men had been selected for special service to God, they vanished beyond the monastery walls and were never seen again. As the Church's ever-increasing desire for wealth and power fueled these young people's labor, the reality was considerably more diabolical. Originally intended to be a hallowed place of atonement and forgiveness, the confessional had been transformed into an extraordinary intelligence collection operation. In order to blackmail and control entire communities, priests meticulously keep track of the transgressions and secrets of their parishioners. Family scandals, concealed debts, and adulterous relationships all turned into tools in the Church's control toolbox. We must keep in mind that these were not individual events, but rather systematic patterns of abuse that pervaded every level of the Scottish Church hierarchy as we dig deeper into this abyss of depravity, beyond its lavish cathedrals and monasteries. Medieval civilization was suffocated by the clerical bureaucracies. Communities they claimed to serve were being drained of their vitality by these parasitic religious orders. Peasants starved outside the gates of monasteries and nuns, but their abbots lived like kings and feasted on luxuries as they made vows of poverty. Through indulgences and relics of questionable origin, the Church's promise of salvation had turned into a commodity that was sold to the highest bidder. Corruption swelled like an infected wound inside the dim hallways of these hallowed institutions. Abbesses sold jobs to rich families so their daughters might have leisurely lives under the pretense of devotion. Monks left their cells for bars, where they substituted drunken raillery for their prayers. Priests gathered information to blackmail the powerful, and the confessional turned into a marketplace where crimes might be forgiven for the appropriate price. Instead than serving as moral compass points, these holy men and women prayed for the weak and in need. Presumably stores of divine knowledge, the monastic libraries were deliberately selected to stifle any ideas that would challenge church authority. Texts that challenged orthodox dogma or contained scientific discoveries were either hidden away or destroyed completely. Not only did the church dictate what individuals thought, but it also dictated what they were permitted to know. While the clergy accumulated knowledge like dragons protecting gold, this intellectual despotism kept society mired in ignorance. The church's systemic exploitation of children was possibly the most upsetting. As unpaid laborers, orphans sent to monasteries were frequently made to work in hazardous conditions while being exhorted to be thankful for the church's generosity. Those who profess to worship a loving God break the spirits of young novices by punishing them with severe corporal punishment for even the smallest transgressions. The church produced a generation of traumatized souls who would live with these wounds for the rest of their lives because it practiced cruelty while preaching kindness. As soon as they were made, the holy promises that characterized religious life were broken into meaningless gestures. In order to avoid scandal, celibate priests had children with country women and then left them behind. To sneak boyfriends into their convents, nuns devised complex plans, transforming places of worship into places of falsehood. Perverted into an instrument of oppression, the pledge of obedience silenced victims who ventured to criticize their superiors. These were systemic breakdowns rather than isolated instances that exposed the decaying foundation beneath the gilded facade of the church. Through deception and manipulation, religious groups amassed enormous estates, leading to economic exploitation of startling proportions. They would target dying lords and put pressure on them to give up their lands in order to ensure the redemption of their souls. In order to enhance already affluent monasteries, widows were forced to give up their inheritances, leaving their children penniless. In medieval Europe, the church rose to become one of the biggest landowners. Not by divine favor, but by calculating greed and manipulating emotions. The misery of many laborers was sometimes used to finance the construction of ostensibly magnificent cathedrals that served as memorials to God's majesty. While constructing palaces for bishops, peasants were compelled to provide labor and materials they could not afford, while they watched their own homes fall apart. In order to increase profits, master builders took shortcuts and used subpar materials, which could result in fatal collapses. These architectural wonders were constructed on a foundation of human suffering and exploitation. Manuscripts were copied and illuminated at monastery scriptoriums, which functioned similarly to medieval sweatshops. Scribes were compensated meagerly for their specialized labor, crouched over tables that harmed their spines, and worked in dim lighting that affected their eyesight. The monasteries benefited greatly from the sale of their exquisite books, but the authors themselves lived in poverty. Because of the harmful inks and colors they employed on a regular basis, many scribes experienced severe health issues. However, their suffering was seen as an essential sacrifice for the greater glory of the church. Even the church's altruistic endeavors were corrupted by hidden agendas. Religious order-run hospitals frequently provide poor quality treatment because they saw their patients more as conversion prospects than as fellow humans in need of sympathy. Instead of using medical expertise, the sick were brutally treated according to religious dogma. People who objected to these procedures or looked for other forms of treatment were labeled heretics and faced excommunication or worse. The pilgrimage roads that traversed Europe turned into exploitative highways. Along these routes, monasteries exploited the dedication and desperation of travelers by charging outrageous prices for simple lodging. At each visit, fake relics were produced and offered for sale, resulting in an economy based on deception and unrealistic optimism. Their faith provided little defense against human avarice, and pilgrims who were unable to pay were turned away and forced to deal with bandits and wild animals. In political menations, religious groups also played a dark role, selling their influence to the highest bidder. Bishops and abbots turned into kingmakers who used territorial wars and succession disputes to further their personal agendas. They weaponized the holy trust between a priest and a penitent by leaking confessional secrets to harm both allies and adversaries. The most immoral actions were concealed behind the Church's assertion of moral authority. The goal of the religious order-run educational system was to create submissive students, not critical thinkers. In monastic institutions, students were instructed to memorize scripture without question, to accept everything without question, and to do so without understanding. Intellectually curious people were either enlisted in the Church's control apparatus or smashed into submission. An organization that feared independent thought either stifled or corrupted the best minds of the medieval era. The repressive structure of the Church was especially harsh on women. Convents that offered refuge frequently turned into jails where women were imprisoned against their choice. Abbasses had complete control over their charges and tortured them psychologically under the pretense of spiritual discipline. Every kind of mistreatment and exploitation was excused by the Church's doctrines regarding women's inferiority, establishing a society in which women's suffering was not only tolerated but also praised as virtue. During this time, Church officials literally put prices on pardon, bringing the notorious indulgence trade to its hideous zenith. Because the poor were sentenced to eternal damnation while the affluent might buy their way into heaven, salvation became a luxury good in this theological economy. The Church's actual goals were exposed by this commercialization of grace, which demonstrated that profit was more important than the people they professed to serve. The Church's methodical eradication of rival spiritual traditions was possibly the most horrifying. Traditional methods of healing were labeled witchcraft. Their practitioners were killed by fire. Centuries ago of cultural history were erased when local festivals and rituals that predates Christianity were brutally suppressed. In order to achieve the Church's goal of uniformity, diversity had to be eradicated, resulting in a spiritual wasteland where only ideas that were accepted could thrive. Religious organizations' dominance over the legal system turned it from a tool of justice to one of terror. With no appeals procedure or defense for the accused, ecclesiastical tribunals functioned in secrecy. Torture was used to coerce confessions, resulting in a court system founded more on fear than on reality. In addition to punishment, those who disobeyed the Church faced total devastation. As if they had never existed, their names were wiped out of history. We discover a depressing truth about the organizations we previously trusted as night falls on our investigation of these troubling chapters. The medieval religious orders that claimed divine authority while serving themselves alone, preached love while acting in hatred, and promised light but delivered only darkness. They left behind a legacy of systematic betrayal rather than spiritual instruction, serving as a warning about what happens when those in positions of power become corrupted. Throughout history, the effects of these corruptions continue to be felt, serving as a reminder that the greatest sins frequently masquerade as the greatest benefits. With their imposing Gothic cathedrals and expansive monastic grounds, the religious organizations of medieval Europe put forth a show of spiritual purity and divine righteousness. Even the most cynical viewers would shudder in revulsion at the murky underworld of corruption, manipulation, and systemic abuse that existed beneath the surface of hallowed ceremonies and holy vows. Although monks and nuns vowed to live chaste, obedient, and impoverished lives, the reality inside monasteries was quite different. These organizations, which were supposed to be shining examples of Christian goodness, had turned into complex plots to amass riches. exercise political influence, and take advantage of the weak. The very pillars upon which these orders professed to have divine authority were decaying from the inside out due to lust, avarice, and an unquenchable desire to dominate the bodies and souls of the people they purported to serve. Think about the organized financial manipulation that took on inside these purportedly holy walls. Abbots and abbessones lived in luxurious quarters with golden chalices, silk tapestries, and lavish feasts that rivaled any royal court, all while preaching to their flocks the benefits of poverty. While their own granaries were brimming with plenty, they took crushing tithes from peasant families who were already having difficulty making ends meet and demanded payment in labor, livestock, and grain. Claiming to act in God's name, the church took away families' houses, land, and basic means of subsistence when they were unable to pay. Like a plague, the practice of simony spread widely across these establishments. Regardless of their moral character or spiritual addition, these religious orders brutally suppressed knowledge that challenged their authority, acting as medieval society's intellectual police. They executed academics whose findings went against church orthodoxy, set fire to libraries, and destroyed scientific literature. The renowned Alexandrian library was destroyed by organized campaigns headed by Christian monks who saw pagan knowledge as demonic degeneration, not just by barbarian invasions. They kept the general populace uneducated and reliant by hoarding literacy, and they used their exclusive access to education to sustain their tight grip on power. These orders' political machinations expose their actual character as power-hungry establishments disguising themselves as religious groups. To increase their temporal power, abbots led private armies, fought battles against other regions, and forged partnerships with vicious warlords. To further their personal agendas, they planned killings, stoked civil wars, and manipulated royal succession issues. The papacy was corrupted by the notorious Boer family, which was not an anomaly but rather the inevitable result of centuries of institutional decay. Even their altruistic deeds, which are sometimes used as proof of their nobility, were tainted by hidden agendas. Child labor began to occur in orphanages, and it got worse when helpless kids were sold into slavery or worked to death. Instead of healing, hospitals were largely used to keep the sick apart from the rest of society. A constant supply of desperate people prepared to do the church's bidding for a crust of bread was ensured by feeding the impoverished just enough to keep them alive and dependent while leaving patients to decay in filthy surroundings and obtaining last rites instead of medical care. These medieval religious groups got more daring in their exploitation and abuse as they solidified their money and authority. Under the cover of religious immunity, what had started out as sincere endeavors at spiritual devotion had evolved into highly skilled criminal businesses. The promise of divine love had been transformed into a nightmare of earthly pain from which there appeared to be no way out by the very institutions that professed to be the main cause of humanity's misery. The obvious crimes of lust and avarice were only one aspect of the corruption that was rife inside medieval ecclesiastical orders. The very idea of spiritual barbatual instruction had been transformed into a weapon against the weak by these purportedly holy organizations who had mastered the art of psychological manipulation. Through a method that would be considered advanced brainwashing today, novices entering monasteries were methodically disintegrated. The purpose of the initiation rites was to systematically remove personal individuality and substitute it with blind obedience. In addition to being punished for crimes they had never committed, new monks were made to confess made-up faults and endured male clergy. Since any protest would be written off as proof of their own spiritual decay, the nuns had no way to file a complaint. The extent of economic exploitation in these establishments was astounding. In order to force novices from wealthy families to swear over their whole inheritance after taking their vows, monasteries would purposefully recruit them. Until they complied, those who resisted were put under increasing psychological pressure. When families tried to step in, they were socially shunned and excommunicated. Many monasteries now functioned more like criminal enterprises than places of worship due to the widespread corruption. They committed widespread acts of fraud, extortion, and forgeries. False relics were produced and offered for sale to unwary pilgrims in order to raise money. Fake miracles were performed. Falsified paperwork and coercive measures that would have made secular bandits happy were used to steal land. These institutions' theological instruction was purposefully perverted to benefit the dishonest leadership. Perverted interpretations of scripture that excused all excesses and abuses were taught to young monks. They were brainwashed into thinking that challenging their bosses was the same as challenging God. Because every new generation of monks was shaped into the same pattern of abuse, this guaranteed that the cycle of corruption would never end. In addition, the monasteries were hubs for political intrigue and conspiracy. Abbots frequently conspired to overthrow secular monarchs who posed a danger to their interests. When it served their interests, they planned killings, harbored fugitives, and stoked up rebellions. Religious organizations' purported neutrality was merely a convenient lie that shielded them from accountability for their conduct when they interfered in politics. Within the gates of monasteries, medical information was purposefully hidden and misinterpreted. If a monk's success challenged the monastery's monopoly on miraculous cures, they were frequently suppressed or exterminated. In order to keep people reliant on the prayers and intercession of the dishonest clergy, beneficial therapies were concealed away, while dangerous or ineffective remedies were advertised. Rather of being used for preservation, monastic library systems were turned into instruments of intellectual control. Books that revealed clerical corruption or went against church teaching were routinely destroyed. Information that could have empowered common people was concealed or purposefully misrepresented. Scribe monks were frequently compelled to modify documents in order to maintain the narrative that their superiors wished to propagate. There was no escape from the exploitation of the monks, not even death, in order to find traces of holiness that could be sold. The bodies of dead monks were frequently the focus of graphic post-mortem examinations. In order to establish new saints for worship, fake stigmata were carved into corpses. Rather of giving the deceased a respectable rest, the funeral customs were created to maximize profits for bereaved relatives. These institutions caused psychological harm that went much beyond their boundaries. Those former monks who were able to flee frequently experienced severe post-traumatic stress disorder, as we now know it. After years of torture and forced seclusion, they found it difficult to establish regular human interactions. In an attempt to deal with the pain of their experiences, many resorted to drinking or engaging in other harmful behaviors. One of the biggest betrayals of trust in history was the corruption that existed inside medieval religious establishments. Instead of embodying the highest goals of human spiritual development, these organizations turned into factories that produced damaged individuals who would continue abusive and exploitative cycles. They poisoned the fundamental idea of ecclesiastical power for years to come, causing irreparable harm to medieval society. Our perception of institutional power and the perils of unquestioned authority is still shaped by the legacy of this corruption. The most dangerous criminals are frequently those who disguise their crimes in the language of morality and righteousness, as the medieval religious orders serve as a sobering reminder. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about what occurs when organizations created to benefit humanity decide to prioritize their own interests. As we look at this troubling period of history, we must keep in mind that everyone in medieval society, not just the monks and nuns imprisoned within these corrupt structures, were the real victims. Faith and corruption in the legacy of medieval ecclesiastical orders. The very organizations that had formerly served as pillars of moral authority and spiritual direction were now drowning in the fallout from their own actions, as the medieval era came to an unavoidable end. The monastic orders that had long dominated spiritual life in Europe were now dealing with a crisis of legitimacy that would change Christianity forever. A powder keg of discontent was poised to blow by the 14th and 15th centuries due to the cumulative weight of corruption, cruelty, and betrayal. Both the educated elite and the general populace began to see the monastery hubs that had once been held in high regard as places of learning and devotion with distrust and disdain. The weight of institutional degradation was causing the same foundations that had supported medieval Christianity to collapse. When opposing popes asserted legitimacy from various towns during the Great Schism of the late 14th century, papal authority had already suffered a devastating blow. The political underbelly of the spiritual facade was revealed by the spectacle of rival religious authority, as their purported spiritual leaders engaged in the identical worldly activities they preached against. The devout looked on in horror as they threw excommunications at one another. Reformist movements that would oppose the status quo were made possible by this crisis of authority. An unexpected weapon against monastic corruption was the printing press, which was created in the middle of the 15th century. Mass production and distribution of critical texts and reformist ideas outside the purview of ecclesiastical authorities was possible for the first time in history. While pamphlets detailing monastic scandals were widely disseminated, ordinary people were able to obtain spiritual information that had previously been filtered through dishonest middlemen thanks to vernacular translations of holy writings. The Renaissance saw the emergence of humanism, which gave medieval religious organizations new intellectual weapons. Equipped with advanced techniques for textual analysis and historical criticism, humanist scholars started to reveal the falsity of numerous claims made by monastic institutions. They exposed the fabrication of relics, the falsification of documents, and the distortion of theological concepts to suit institutional interests rather than spiritual truth. Monastic authority was also seriously threatened by economic shifts. Outside the conventional feudal system controlled by religious organizations, new hubs of wealth and power were established by the expansion of urban banking and commerce. Monasteries' centuries-long economic monopoly were challenged by merchant families and guilds. The emergence of universities, many of which were secular establishments, offered monastic schools competition from alternative educational institutions. After decades of feeding within religious orders, the moral decay ultimately reached a tipping point where it was impossible to ignore or conceal. Narratives of money misappropriation, spiritual manipulation, and sexual assault had grown so regular that they were no longer considered unusual. It was now hard to reconcile the principles these institutions professed to uphold with the realities of their day-to-day functioning. Many ecclesiastical institutions were shown to be spiritually bankrupt by the 14th century Black Death. Many monasteries had failed to offer the solace and guidance that people sorely needed in times of true hardship. Too many religious leaders had either run away from their duties or taken advantage of the situation to further exploit others, rather than providing hope and healing. Their actions were a glaring and devastating contrast to those of secular authorities who continued to serve their communities. Established institutional resistance frequently thwarted reform campaigns that had arisen from inside the religious orders themselves. People who aimed to restore the traditional values of simplicity and poverty, such as the Franciscan spirituals, were frequently punished by their own organizations. Exile, or worse, was the fate of the Dominicans who opposed papal corruption. These internal disputes showed that the institutions were unable to reform themselves from within because they had become so corrupted. One of the final attempts to reform the medieval church using conventional methods was the Concilia movement in the early 15th century. Church councils worked to rectify the greatest excesses and give religious organizations some degree of legitimacy again. However, the same political and economic forces that had initially caused the issues eventually undercut these attempts. Numerous others were persuaded that more drastic measures would be required when the Concilia reform failed. During this time of change, women who had frequently been the main targets of abuse and corruption in monasteries started to find their voices. Bee of Sweden and Catherine of Siena were two examples of female religious reformers and mystics who directly criticized institutional corruption by using their spiritual influence. Their highly read and revered books and predictions provide compelling evidence of the immorality of religious organizations. Another threat to monastic rule was the emergence of lay religious groupings. Bypassing the institutional mediation that had been the root of so much corruption, organizations such as the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life placed an emphasis on individual piety and a direct relationship with God. These movements showed that spirituality might thrive outside of the conventional monastic environment. Religious institutions started to be seen with increasing skepticism in popular culture. Devastating depictions of dishonest clergy and religious leaders were seen in works such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Stories and folk ballads ridiculed the pretenses of abbots and monks. The way the general public perceived religious authority was fundamentally altered by this cultural transformation. Ecclesiastical supremacy could be challenged by an alternative power structure brought forth by the rise of nation governments with strong royal authority. Formerly subservient to religious authorities, kings and princes now gained the authority to impose their will on frail monastic establishments. The subordination of religious authority to secular power and the confiscation of church lands grew more frequent. The foundation for the religious upheavals that would transform European Christianity was laid when the medieval era gave way to the early modern era. Many of the corrupt organizations that had controlled medieval religious life would meet their demise during the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Because decades of institutional failure and abuse had set the foundation, the reformers' critiques of monastic corruption would find a sympathetic audience. In addition to being a religious revolution, the destruction of monasteries in Protestant nations signified the realization that these establishments had grown so corrupted that reform was impossible. After centuries of exploitation, the riches was eventually divided, but frequently to non-religious officials instead of the impoverished, who were supposed to get it in the first place. The Counter-Reformation recognized the necessity for significant reforms in religious institutions, even in Catholic nations that opposed Protestant reform. The Council of Trent implicitly acknowledged past shortcomings by enforcing new standards of behavior and responsibility. More strict regulations and improved control systems were introduced by new religious organizations in an effort to stop the excesses that had plagued monasticism in the Middle Ages. Enlightenment intellectuals who used past instances of institutional failure to support their arguments for religious tolerance, the separation of church and state, and individual conscience were influenced by the intellectual heritage of medieval clerical corruption. Strong arguments were made against the consolidation of temporal and spiritual power in the same institutions due to the documented abuses of medieval monasteries. The societal impact was just as significant. A wider mistrust of established hierarchies and organizations was influenced by the decline in faith in ecclesiastical authority that marked the late medieval age. Eventually, aspirations for social reform and democratic movements that went well beyond religious issues would be fueled by this skepticism. It had a long-lasting psychological effect on European society. Claims to moral authority based only on institutional position were deeply distrusted by generations of people who had endured abuse at the hands of corrupt religious institutions. One of the defining traits of contemporary Western civilization would be this cultural trend towards personal accountability and judgment. Monastic corruption had long-term economic repercussions as well. Economic stagnation and inequality were exacerbated by the misallocation of resources that had been a feature of medieval religious institutions. These riches could be put to better use after being eventually released from the corrupt monastic authority, which helped to fuel the early modern era's economic vitality. The impact on schooling was revolutionary. New educational establishments that prioritize critical thinking and empirical observation over written memorization of sanctioned books arose as monastic schools lost their monopoly on education. The scientific revolution and the contemporary university system were made possible by this change in educational philosophy. The political consequences lasted for generations. Strong justifications for restricting the political authority of religious authorities were offered by the medieval religious establishment's inability to fulfill their moral obligations. The understanding that religious organizations could not be trusted with temporal power served as the foundation for the separation of church and state idea, which would later become essential to contemporary democratic administration. The cultural and artistic heritage was equally important. New forms of artistic expression that placed more emphasis on human experience and faith than on institutional authority were sparked by dissatisfaction with corrupt religious institutions. Renaissance literature and art, which praised individual accomplishment and human dignity, would flourish as a result of this change. In addition to a list of past wrongdoings, the shadowy side of medieval religious institutions serves as a warning about the distorting effects of unbridled power. When left to function without control or responsibility, the institutions that started out with the admirable goals of learning, service, and spiritual direction eventually turned into tools of oppression and exploitation. Because they lost sight of the essential idea that organizations exist to serve people, not the other way around, the medieval religious orders eventually collapsed. They started the processes that would ultimately bring about their demise when they started putting their personal money and power ahead of their professed goal of serving the spiritual community. As we debate issues of institutional responsibility, transparency, and the appropriate boundaries of organizational power, the lessons learned from medieval monastic corruption are still applicable today. These religious organizations' histories serve as a reminder that, in the absence of strong checks and balances, any organization, no matter how honorable its guiding ideals, is susceptible to corruption. Beginning in the late medieval era, European Christianity saw a transition that was not solely the consequence of political or theological disagreements. It was essentially a reaction to the moral failings of establishments that had violated the faith that generations of devoted Christians had placed in them. A constant reminder of the cost of institutional corruption and the significance of remaining vigilant against the misuse of power in all of its manifestations is provided by the sinister legacy of medieval religious orders. The monastic orders of the Middle Ages ultimately succumbed to their own prosperity. The circumstances that led to their corruption were brought about by the riches and influence they amassed over centuries of exploitation. Their tale is among the most potent illustrations in history of how institutional self-interest can corrupt lofty ideals and how even the most seemingly stable institutions can fall if structural issues are not addressed. Medieval religious orders had to face the inevitable and essential consequences of their actions. Reform was no longer feasible because of how widespread their corruption had grown and how systematic their abuses had become. Europe's religious life could only be revitalized and refocused towards its initial goals of moral instruction, philanthropic work, and spiritual development by dissolving and replacing them. Medieval ecclesiastical orders were rife with corruption that went the coffers of dishonest abbots. Animal bones and useless baubles, blessed by men who had long since given up any pretense of genuine belief, were the purported relics that attracted these crowds. The loss of knowledge that took place inside these walls was not just carelessness, it was deliberate obstructing of human advancement. Monks burned libraries that had centuries' worth of collected knowledge and purposefully destroyed classical texts that were against religious dogma. They tortured and killed academics who ventured to seek out knowledge that was banned, and they suppressed scientific breakthroughs that contradicted their worldview. The graveyards of human intellectual achievement were the very establishments that professed to conserve learning. These orders' recruitment strategies demonstrated their actual predatory tendencies. They primarily targeted individuals without social safety or family ties, who were the most vulnerable members of society. Promises of education and spiritual fulfillment were used to entice young people, but they were ultimately caught in exploitative institutions from which it was practically hard to break free. Their vows, which were gained by duress and deceit, condemned them to years of torture and suffering. The very sacraments themselves were corrupted as well. With the Eucharist being withheld to punish individuals who questioned authority, Holy Communion became an instrument of control. With the secrets revealed in alleged sanctity being used to influence and control, confession turned into a tool for obtaining blackmail information. Instead of celebrating a divine union, marriage rites were perverted into ornate fasts intended to transfer cash and property. The legal systems that were governed by these directives ridiculed the concept of divine justice. The accused had no chance of vindication because trials were prearranged affairs. Evidence was falsified, witnesses were intimidated or forced to testify, and penalties were intended to frighten rather than to correct. Under monasteries, the dungeons were transformed into horrifying places where torture was regarded as an art form and supported by the perverse theory that bodily pain might cleanse the soul. The medical procedures used in these facilities demonstrated a ruthless, almost demonic, contempt for human life. Instead of providing medical care, monastic hospitals were used as testing grounds for people. Without their consent, patients underwent horrifying operations. Their pain was excused as essential to the development of medical understanding. When they became too much of a burden, the old and sick were frequently killed. Their belongings were included into the monastery's properties, and their deaths were ascribed to natural causes. These orders also caused as devastating environmental damage. They strip-mined the ground for precious metals, poisoned rivers with the garbage from their industrial operations, and cut down entire forests. Worst evil frequently poses as righteousness, and that, in order to prevent humanity from experiencing the atrocities of the past, we must always be on the lookout for corruption.